Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Linda Smith, for those of you who don't know me, and I am the Director of the Early Childhood Initiative at the Bipartisan Policy Center here in Washington, D.C. Today's topic, childcare in rural America. What have we learned? And what we're going to do today is draw on some of the work that we've been doing over the last couple of years, actually, not just with our survey work and trying to talk to parents and understand what parents want, but also our work on the child care gap as we know it in the country, and some more recent work on trying to understand the economic impact of the gap on our communities, and especially on our rural communities. So what we're going to do today is have a conversation about that, go over some data, and then get into a conversation with a panel of people who are really experiencing childcare in rural America today. So I want to go to the next slide. So what do we really know about childcare in our rural states? If we can go to the next slide. There we go. So what we have done over the last couple of years at BPC is look at the supply versus the potential need for childcare in our states. We have so far mapped 35 of the states. And what we set out to do was really to look at what's the actual gap in childcare across the country, and understand that we had to do a pivot when COVID-19 hit. So we basically have paused at 35 states right now, but have continued to examine the economic impact. So what we're trying to do in this study was to look actually at what we think the actual gap is between what is the potential need for care, and that is not the same as the demand, but the potential need for care for children under the age of 6 with all available parents in the workforce. And what we have found is that across those 35 states, close to 32% of all children under 6 do not have access to a formal childcare option. So that was one of the things. One of the other things that we were trying to do, and go to the next slide if you will, in terms of our methodology, we started to look at this issue of potential need versus what is it that parents really want, and what are their preferences, because what they want versus the potential need are two different things. So in looking at that, you see on the slide in front of you what we looked at, the number of children with all available parents in the workforce, and then we started to look at driving distance to parents from parents to childcare facilities, and did a methodology that would look at how far parents would go reasonably. And that led us to actually the first survey that we did with Morning Consult, which was, we didn't really know when we started this work if parents preferred childcare closer to home or closer to work. And so we set about trying to answer some of those questions, and in so doing have now, this is the 5th survey that we've done with Morning Consult in looking at specifically the rural issues. So if you look at the next slide, please, it shows where we have what's going on in rural America. Rural parents are significantly more likely to drive more than 10 miles to access care. And we'll dig into those numbers a little bit in terms of what we found in the most recent survey. In one state, we had access to the subsidy children and their distance from their care. And I need to note on this slide, there's one thing that needs to get corrected. In that particular state, parents who were living in urban areas were driving about 3.5 miles, and in rural areas about 7.5. And I think the chart says 10 there, so it's actually 7.5, and we'll correct that. But in any event, trying to figure out, exactly where we have these gaps, not to, so much the desert concept, because what we're trying to find is there care within a reasonable distance to families. The next thing, if we go to the next slide, please, we were looking at the need in rural versus urban. And so you can see on this chart that, well, there about 3/4 of the children really are living in urban suburban areas. Almost a quarter are living in rural parts of this country. And that's a significant number of children in the 35 states that we've mapped. This is not all states, this is the 35 states. So where the numbers of children are higher in the urban areas, the unmet need for care or the underserved population as a percentage is higher in our rural areas. And I don't think that would be real surprise to most people on this call. So if you go to the next slide, this next slide looks at the average gap, and it compares the urban to the rural. And you can see here that the gap is significantly higher, 35.1%, as you'll see from the red bars, as opposed to 28.9, the blue bars, which is the urban suburban community. The next thing that we did, if you go to the next slide, is we started to look into the economic impact of the gap. And we're trying we're trying to be conservative on this. So what is the impact of almost 32% of children in this country, in the 35 states, not having access to childcare, to some type of formal care? And so we started to look into this using a number of different reports that had already been done. But if you can see, again, this is in 35 states. So in terms of the next slide, the methodology that we used looked solely at the impact of the gap on household income and earnings, businesses, and tax revenue. So that's a fairly narrow look at the economic impact. We did not get into things like the impact of the cost of care, the affordability, and some of those things. So we came up with an estimate for the initial year, plus then the over 10 years, what that would look like. And if you, we're going to load into the chat links to this work so that you can take a look at this. But in doing this work, we looked at a number of other pieces that had been done. For example, the Council for Strong America, the University of Nebraska has done some work, Maryland and Louisiana. So we tried to look at what had already been done and build off of that work before we set out to do something, to do our economic impact. So if we go to the next slide, this shows the economic impact of the child care gap in 35 states as somewhere between $32.79 and $49.93 billion. So that is a very big economic impact in rural parts of this country, and one that we think we need to start focusing on and figuring out how we're going to address that. So if we go to the next one, the next slide just shows the lack of access to childcare that has had significant impact on these rural communities. In some of the states that we did, you'll see from the chart that there's less of an impact, some states more. But in any event, there is an impact in most of our states, a few not so much, and those are small and mostly urban type states. So what I'm going to do now is turn it and bring in Claire Taylor, who is who has been working with us with Morning Consult, and who has been doing the survey work for us now. Claire, I think it's the 5th survey that we've done together. And she's going to join me to go over the results of the most recent parent survey, where we specifically targeted rural parents to see what they were thinking and what some of the issues that they were concerned about. So I'm going to go to the first slide. And Claire, I think we can just kind of go cruise over this one rather quickly. The goals of the survey: to understand what parents wanted, their access, and some of those, the use of financial support, similar to what we have done. And what you're going to hear Claire talk about is comparisons from this work to the other work that we've done, and how do these things stack up in rural. So the methodology, Claire, I don't know if you want to say anything about that, but go ahead on the next.
Yeah, on the next slide, it just has some more specifications on the audience that we surveyed here. So It was about 650 rural parents with a child under the age of 5 with at least one member of the household currently employed. So we were fairly specific here to really understand this audience's childcare needs. And like Linda said, we had surveyed employed parents back in May of 2021. So throughout this research, some of these questions are similar to what we've looked at before to be able to specifically dive into what are we seeing among rural parents to understand their needs and preferences.
So Claire, let's go to the first slide and let's start by asking a couple of the basic questions. What did we learn from this survey? What's the same and what's different?
Yeah, so, what was the same from other survey data? I think on work arrangements, we had talked about this before we asked how far in advance are you aware of your work schedule? And we can get into that. But what was different was we were able to dive deeper into understanding rural communities and how that differs by community size. So you can see here, we wanted to understand what parents have access to in their community as far as childcare providers. And we had parents across a variety of size of communities. And so we learned that overall, 39% of rural parents living in a town with less than 500 residents say that there's a childcare program within 10 miles of their home. And that number just grows as the town size gets larger. And we see here when we asked about specific types of childcare arrangements, child centers, pre-K programs, Head Start programs, and family childcare homes, the larger your community size is, the more likely you are to have access to these different childcare programs. And the gap is consistent and is large. It's about 30% looking at parents in town sizes of less than 500 compared to those in communities of larger than 10,000 people in their community.
And so let's go to the next slide. Looking at the next one and how, what they're relying on in terms of what are parents thinking about that, and where are they right now with this, and how did this differ?
Yes, this was one where we really see differences when we ask parents what is their current primary childcare arrangement. So here among rural parents, we see 45% are personally providing care, or their spouse or partner is providing care for their child. And this is nearly double of what we found in May of parents overall. 23% of parents overall are personally providing care. So we see that rural parents are much more likely to be personally providing care or relying on an informal childcare arrangement of some sort rather than using a formal childcare arrangement. And I think there's some relationship to what we saw on the first slide of what do they have access to in their community. One thing that is consistent on this type of question is how this varies by demographic type. So when we look at this question by income level, we see those with higher income more likely to be using a formal childcare arrangement, as well as parents living in a larger town size likely to be using a formal childcare arrangement. So I think there's some interesting overlap that we see between those two questions.
I think the interesting thing for all of us, and it's been pretty consistent over all of the survey work, is the number of parents who rely on their own, either a partner or a relative to provide that care. Although higher here, it's still been pretty consistent across our survey work. And I think that's been one of the standouts of all of the work that we've done. Let's look at the next slide and let's see what's going on there in terms of preferences, because this is where it gets a little more interesting.
Yes, it's getting exciting. We asked if childcare were free for your family, what type of childcare arrangement would you most prefer? So here we see childcare, we see that they're still preferring to personally provide care with 25% preference, saying that's their preference, but really closely split with a childcare center. So we see that very differ from what they're using. 45% are personally providing care. And that is a high number of 25% who prefer that, but you still see 22% preferring to use a childcare center.
And I think that's where it gets interesting, because when you put it to them, if it's free, that changes, I think, the conversation. And the last two surveys we've done have had that question in them with, I think, somewhat surprising results. I don't know what your reaction to that has been, but I've been really interested in, even if it's free, what do they still prefer? And a lot of them still prefer the parents themselves or some family member.
And in this question, it's free and in a convenient location. So I think it takes away the accessibility too of, this is available to you, what do you prefer? And we see still preferring personal care. And interesting demographics on this one, where parents with a younger child are more likely to prefer personally providing care, where we see parents with older children are more likely to prefer a child care center.
If we go to the next slide here, this one I think is also pretty telling, because I think we often, these numbers are extremely high in terms of what influences their decision not to work. And I think this one looks pretty much like a standout. Claire, what did you think when you saw it?
Definitely. This was a new question that we hadn't asked before, of parents who are personally, or say that their spouse or partner is not currently working, trying to understand how much is childcare an issue or a factor of this decision, as you were talking about the economic impact of trying to understand the impact that having accessible childcare can have to the workforce. And so here to see that 64% say that childcare responsibilities significantly influenced their partner's decision not to work. That's a very high number. 86% overall say it was somewhat of an influence. And so I think the next question is, if you had access to this, how would that change your decision to work or not to work? If this was something that was accessible and affordable to you, would that change your family's decision to personally be providing care rather than using a childcare program?
Yeah, that was a pretty big number, I thought. And I think that's something that's worth us giving a lot of thought to as we work on rural state policies. And I can't wait to bring our panel in to talk a little bit more about that one. So then let's talk a little bit more about the issue of trust. In the next slide, we've been looking at this over all of our surveys, and this is such a big deal for parents.
It is. And so this is another thing that was different about this survey, was we wanted to understand, are rural parents considering a formal childcare arrangement, and what influenced their decision to choose a formal childcare arrangement or to not? And we see that overall that 68% of rural parents considered a formal childcare arrangement. And we wanted to understand, why did they choose this? And so we see trust right at the top, 47%, higher than all of the other factors that we tested. And like you said, Linda, this is consistent when we asked in any type of setting, in an open end and select all that apply, trust in the provider is so important. The fact that trumps cost was shocking to me. Cost is number two with quality of care and health and safety, but trust is top of mind as parents are deciding, as that's an influencer into why they are choosing a formal childcare arrangement.
I do think that's something that our childcare and early childhood community needs to give serious thought to, because that trust issue has stood out over time. And it's one of these things that I don't think we're doing a very good job of helping parents understand sort of what's in place and what's involved with making these programs. And we can talk a little bit about this when we get to the panel. Why these programs are safe? Why do parents trust providers? What is it about that they want to what do they want to know? So I think keeping on going here, The issue of the parents who did consider a formal childcare option, why aren't they selecting that? And what did we find there?
Yeah, so if we, on this slide, this was among those who said they considered a formal childcare arrangement, but that's not what they're currently using. And here we see, again, cost is number one. So here we see that be top of mind, 55%, which I think we can understand in some of the other questions when we ask, what is the maximum amount that your household can afford to pay for childcare, that a large percentage of rural parents, it's just not a part of their household budget to be able to afford childcare. So we see that arise here, but I think what was interesting was that trust was number two. So we see in both why and why not that parents are using for formal childcare, that cost and trust are top of mind. So I think you're right, Linda, in understanding how do childcare providers establish trust with parents as they are considering different arrangements. What is that? How do you gain that when parents are visiting a childcare location before their child is enrolled, to be able to show parents that this is a location that they can entrust their child to be at every day.
Claire, before we move on to the panel, is there anything else in all of this that you thought stood out in your mind as you go back and look over time of what we've learned on all of these things?
I think things that were the same across all the studies that we have done is the lack of awareness of work schedule. I know I mentioned this up top, but we asked parents, how far in advance are you aware of your work schedule? And we see nearly a third are aware of their work schedule 2 weeks in advance or less. And that percentage, when we look at that by demographic among service workers, 49% are aware of their work schedule in 2 weeks in advance or less. So as we think about the employer component of this, how can that be something that is considered to try to stabilize parents' work environment so they can stabilize a childcare provider? And on the childcare side, we ask about need for childcare during traditional and non-traditional hours, and that consistently we see about a quarter of parents, we saw that in May in our survey overall, as well in this study among rural parents, that about a quarter need care in non-traditional hours and specifically in the evening. And so I think that's a continued data point we're seeing, and how is that something that childcare providers can consider to meet?
Yeah, I think, and we're going to talk about this a little bit because in talking with, Candace and one of the providers that we're going to talk to, this issue has, definitely been top of mind. How do we keep people employed in this country? And we know we have an employment shortage. Mm-hmm. How do we get employers to work with our childcare programs to try to better understand the scheduling issues these parents face? And it's chaotic when you don't know your work schedule more than 2 weeks in advance. How do you schedule childcare around that? Becomes a real issue. So I think what we're going to do now is move into what I think is the most interesting part of the conversation here, and bring our panelists in to talk about some of what we've seen here, what this means to them. So I'm going to start by introducing our panel, if we can. Patty Butler, who everybody has to put up with me being from Montana. I have a preference, and Patty is is head of the state child care program in the state of Montana. I believe you're called the bureau chief, Patty. And Patty is in, I think, one of the largest and most rural of our big Western states, and to talk to her about her experience, not just in managing the child care program for the state, but also her experience as a child care provider herself and in running a child care center. And next we have Candace Horn, who is a child care provider in rural Georgia, who just opened her third site there and has we've been talking about some of the challenges that she's had, especially in hiring people during this time. And then finally, we have Ellie Lafkin, who is a parent in the Shenandoah Valley here in Virginia, and has been faced with looking for and finding childcare in a very rural part of the state of Virginia. So we're going to bring our panel in. I'm going to start, first of all, with Patty. I think we know that there are lots of variables in childcare, and distance is one of them in a state like Montana, cultural issues, religious preferences, a number of things, affordability, as Claire just put on the table. The list goes on and on. So I was going to ask you, in terms of the bigger gap that you have in Montana, what do you think you could do as a state administrator of some of this? Sort of what are your experiences been with this? And then how do we begin to overcome the challenges that you face in a state as big and as with the distance of Montana?
Thanks, Linda. And good afternoon, everybody. I'm honored to be asked to be on this panel and honored to represent Montana as a large rural state. I spent 35 years as a provider in various sizes of programs in a very rural part of Montana, and then moved into this position, and hopefully am able to continue my work in maybe a different way and make a difference. But I think really it comes down to, and frankly, I guess the older you get to look back a little bit farther, but some of the same issues that have been there for a long time are still there, but they're just more obvious now and affecting our workforce more. And one of those I think is compensation and career development. So why would you want to be a childcare provider, and what's in it for you as a long-term career? And can you support your family on those in this profession? A couple things that might help that, I look at education opportunities and funding to scholarship that education. Childcare is not a high return profession, so we need to support that for that education, and then to build that career and that income earning basis. The other thing I think in childcare is not a standalone; it's a part of a family unit. However you look at it, wherever you're at, and so I think it takes a community. So the employer is a part of it, the community is a part of it, the agencies that are within a community, and they're different for every community. And I use community loosely. It can be a subdivision, actually, that can be your community. But I think the supports that come from that will build into that compensation and that career advancement, which is all about trust and respect. The other piece that we see that's a challenge for our providers, particularly in rural areas, is facility and zoning issues. We're seeing that more so now, and I wonder if that's not because maybe some of our agencies have a little bit more oversight, fire departments, sanitation departments, zoning, insurance. Those pieces really play into the fact of where can you have your facility or your home that turns into a business. I think there's a lot of oversight, and I think that a lot of misunderstanding about who we are and what a child care provider actually does in and for their community.
Mm-hmm. Patty, you talk about the professional development and the education piece of this. In a state like Montana, how, in terms of broadband and sort of some of the online learning, are your providers pretty well connected or not? How is that working in the state?
We depend on online platforms for our training, for our information, for education, and oftentimes, we think we're providing access. But if you don't have broadband in your home, then you need to complete your workday of 10 hours, 12 hours, and then drive to the nearest community that might have a library open till 8 o'clock to be able to attend a town hall or your training. So it's not as easy as it sounds if you don't have that access. And in an agricultural state like Montana is, many of those convenient family, friend, neighbors, or family homes are in areas that do not have broadband access. And that, those of us that make policy decisions think we're doing the right thing. And in reality, if they don't have the access where they work, which is in their homes oftentimes, then really we haven't met the need.
Mhm. Has any of the dollars recently been able to help with that you've had coming into the state?
Yes, Linda, some of the dollars that are coming into our state are being looked at for infrastructure build out within the state. One of those is broadband. We're hopeful. Those decisions haven't been made fully yet, but we're hoping that while we're building our bridges out and repairing those, that we're also looking at broadband to connect people, and for a lot of reasons.
Yeah. I want to go next to Ellie. Ellie, you're in rural Virginia, in a beautiful part of the state, the Shenandoah Valley, no doubt about that. You've been living in this part of the state and had your own challenges with finding childcare. Can you tell us a little bit about your experiences? What were you looking for? What were the barriers to finding it, and sort of what your recommendations are on this as a parent who's actually sadly had a very terrible situation occur?
Right, of course. So my one of my daughters was an infant when she was placed in an in-home daycare, and she unfortunately was put in an unsafe situation and did not survive. I currently have a 4-year-old son who's in daycare right now. So the way that we searched for, or the things we looked for and the way we searched for daycare for my surviving daughter and my son is significantly different. We didn't have the resources. I feel as if we didn't have the resources with our first daughter that we found out the hard way so we had the resources with our second and third child, excuse me. So when we are looking for childcare, we were looking for, of course, availability, which is very hard to find around here. And then, of course, a center that would meet the needs of the hours that my husband and I work. And then, of course, quality. And unfortunately, sometimes they have to go in that order, especially when you're in a rural area and you don't have access to very many options. So if there is availability, which is rare in this area for quite a few centers, you then have to look at affordability. For a 4-year-old right now in our area, in a center-based daycare, we pay $180 a week. Maybe that's not a lot in an urban area, but for someone, for our community and for my neighborhood, that's a lot of money. And it's not obtainable for the majority of our area, to be honest. And so we decided we had to make that sacrifice, that we weren't going to go the in-home, unlicensed, completely unregulated route again, as we did with Camden, my first daughter. And so we were going to have to make those sacrifices in order to put our children in the center-based childcare. So unfortunately, parents are forced into those choices in our area. So affordability and quality and also accessibility, are very large in the rural areas.
I think that, and they're all challenges and they're all equally difficult in some of these remote areas of the country. Do you have any thoughts in terms of what would help the situation in a community like yours?
Well, of course, accessibility. It all comes back down to accessibility. The more open spaces we have in our area, the more children are able to go. And then, of course, hours. Quite a few people in the rural areas, they work shift work. So if you're working 3 to 11 in the afternoon, then you're not going to be able to use a center-based care around here, and you're going to be forced into unlicensed or an unregulated home daycare in this area. So I think increasing access and then, of course, affordability.
want to put a pin in that because I think that this, this shift work issue is one that we're picking up on a lot. And I see Claire shaking her head on that one, that we have been seeing that, and especially some of the hours of that, and in rural America, the hours have got to be a real challenge in some of these programs. I want to go next to Candace. Candace, you provide childcare at 3 locations in a rural part of Georgia. And, kudos to you. You just opened another new program despite all of the challenges with COVID and everything else that's been going on. What have been the biggest challenges you've faced, and especially in opening a new program here recently?
Working in the child care profession for over 13 years, I've faced many challenges. Building relationship with parents and children, finding qualified and trustworthy staff, providing a safe environment, and separating my work life from my home life are just a few challenges that I've faced over the years. But I've learned throughout the years that the child care profession is a continuous learning experience with time. You have to build relationships and collaborating with different organizations in my community, and having a supportive family has been very essential for me and has helped me manage throughout these challenging times. COVID has impacted, caused a huge impact all over for a lot of providers, the school system. So we're just trying to regroup and do the best that we can to continue to meet the needs in the community for our parents.
You mentioned earlier before we started that you'd had challenges finding staff recently. Can you talk a little bit more about that and sort of what are the challenges and what are you doing about it?
Honestly, I'm just going with the flow because meeting my standards could be a bit difficult because I know what I'm looking for my children. We provide a learning environment for our students, and some people think just working in a daycare center is just letting the kids play all day, but adding structure to our program makes it complicated to get the younger generation to understand that we have to engage with the children, get them on the schedule and get them ready for public school. So that's been a challenge for me, is just having people to feel the same way that I feel about the care that I provide.
It is also one of the challenges, I think, and I'd be curious as to your thoughts on this, of, the ability to pay people, it's hard work. Let's all be honest with each other, and it's hard work. And our ability to pay our staff well, while not passing that on to parents, has become an even more challenging type of thing. How do you balance those things?
It's difficult. It is very difficult because I don't look at my staff as daycare providers. I look at my staff as teachers. So providing the training for the staff to make sure that they are accommodating the kids how I feel like they should, it's been complicated because now it's the staff have to take care of their training. So that's another expense coming from the staff unless I say, hey, I'm going to take care of the training to make sure, just to be that for them, because it's being in a small town. Like she said, she paid, they're charging her $180 for childcare. I'm here charging $95 per week. So to be able to pay my staff for all that we give, it honestly doesn't balance out. Because one day you can be full, the next couple of weeks or months or so, you could drop 10 to 20 children. And just being able to keep the staff that you have, sometimes it's complicated. It's very challenging sometimes.
One of the things, and Patty, I want to go back to you on this one, because you actually were a family child care provider at one point. I think you said in your past, or a group home provider. And I'm curious as to what the survey results showed was, I think one of the standouts in the survey to me was that the lack of family child care that we found. I guess in my head, I had always thought that family childcare had a much bigger role in rural America than this survey indicated. And I'd be curious as to your thoughts about that, and what, if anything, can we do in terms of the whole issue of small family childcare homes, especially when it comes to infants?
Yeah, thanks, Linda. I agree with you. When I read the survey, I'm like, okay, so what we know, positives to family childcare, your siblings are served together. Your home setting is often close to your home. So it's a neighborhood situation, gets back to that trust and that respect. There's oftentimes a shared culture or language that you find in a family home that you don't find, that's harder to recognize or find in center. Families our family homes can sometimes provide that non-traditional type of care for those hours. So why has that changed, and why is that not out there? From my perspective, in doing it and then seeing it from now, it is, I think the isolation maybe has increased. And so the support system, whether that's within your community or with other family providers, is more difficult now. And particularly, we can speak to COVID in the last year and a half, but even before that, that isolation may not build the system. And that may have, people want to go to work so they can see people, they can be social, they can have other adults around. So I wonder about that. And I look to that as building a state's policies should be building out and looking at networks of family providers to be able to support them. So I wonder about that. And then the other piece is the economic stability. And I think Candace spoke to that, is that I think that family providers have to recognize that they are business owners and that their policies are going to support their business, meaning that if you're short 10 kids or 20 kids the next week, you're still getting paid for that. Just like you have to pay your mortgage when you're on vacation, your house still costs you money even if you're not living in it. You still have to pay for your enrollment slot in your program. And I think some of those programs, both from a policymaker's angle and from an owner, that you have to protect yourself in order to have value at the end of the day in your pocket. You're a business owner, but then also to be able to continue to support your business and stay in your business without losing, a lot of money and compromising your family, frankly. So I think that economic stability, which would include shared services, that increase use of subsidy and those reimbursement rates, and that all, I think a lot of it might have to do with policy and what state administrators or states and communities can do to support.
I think that's a very interesting, aspect of some of this, Patty, and Candace, I think this is sort of what you were getting at too, is the stability of the funding, especially in small programs in a rural part of the country. And I hate to keep going back to my own experience, but my own experience when I was living in Eastern Montana was there was one family childcare provider in the community, and she was usually full. Okay, and she was licensed. She was state licensed and those things. But I used to think about, well, if let's just say 2 children drop out and her income goes down, how does she pay the mortgage? Because there's no continuity, and it could be a long time before there's 2 more children in that very small rural community. So how do we begin to think about stabilizing some of these very small programs in rural parts of our country so that they have the income that they need to keep going? And I think, Candace, you were alluding to that. If you lose 10 kids, you're in trouble, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
So how do we balance some of this? I guess I'd ask all of you to comment on that, because Ellie, to your point, you're struggling to pay $180 a week. It's hard to think about you're going to pay and not have your child be there. So there's all different sides to this you know, to this story. And I'm curious as to where the balance is in your minds. Anybody? I mean,
Sure.
Candace, or well, no, go to you first, Patty. I mean, what, you've been on both sides of the equation.
Yeah, I think it's a shared responsibility, to be honest with you. Not necessarily Candace. I don't know Candace. I really look forward to meeting you though. But some providers, and particularly family providers, FFNs, family, friend, and neighbors, some of our smaller providers in our smallest communities and our most rural areas don't necessarily look at what they do as a small business. They look at it and caring for children as something that they are in love with and that they're very good at, but not necessarily look at it from a sustainable wage earning profession. And so if we want that continuity of that person to stay in business and that care to continue for children and families, then you have to look at it as a business that's sustainable. So part of it is in teaching and in learning small business practices and staying in business. The other part belongs to policymakers and putting policies together that support providers and that support families in being able to be consistent with payment. And whether you're a subsidy assistance, childcare assistance, or whether you're or not, or where is that line for who does get assistance and who doesn't. So I think there's a responsibility from policymakers to be able to help providers to stay in business and to provide that access for families.
Candace, did you want to say something on this one?
I agree with Miss Patty. But I will say here in Georgia, to be a lead teacher, they require the lead teacher to have a CDA. So if I'm looking for someone with the experience and I can't find that person, it's easy for me to take that person and invest in that person to make sure that the children are, have the proper care needed. So it's always going to be that balance as an owner to make sure that you setting that solid foundation for your children. And again, if I have 20, okay, so if I say, okay, once you get your CDA, I'm going to pay you $12 per hour, and the kids drop. We have a situation with COVID happen again, and it could put, you in a situation of having to close your business down. So just trying to figure out that balance to balance everything out. Again, that has been a challenge, but I totally agree with Miss Patty.
Mm-hmm. Ellie, from your perspective, these things, in terms of this trust issue, back to this issue, and what in your mind, for example, what's the most important for you to know about a family child care provider, for example? Let's go back and say you're looking for care again, and you really are going to consider a home-based provider. What would be the things in your mind that you'd be looking for most importantly? And how much is it things like business training versus what else is there that we're missing?
So not necessarily business training, following a business model, but as Patty mentioned, knowing that they do view themselves as a business, as a professional, is very important to me. That they want to meet certain safety and health guidelines, and they want to be educated on how to properly educate the 0 through 5 age range. That their home or the center can pass basic safety inspections. That I know if a fire breaks out, my child's going to get out safely because they all know what to do. And certain, little things like that you don't necessarily think about until you really do a deep dive into it, they add up fairly quickly. And I think that is a huge gap in Virginia of the unlicensed home daycares or child centers, and then versus the licensed and regulated home family day homes or centers. So again, it circles back to what Patty said. I think they really need to view themselves as a professional business.
I'm gonna try and, I know we do want to get to a point where we can take some questions from the audience. So a couple of things I'd really like to ask each of you again. You know, the survey, you know, basically was pretty stark in the sense of the availability of childcare is influencing parents' decisions to go to work. And we as a nation need some of these people in the workforce. That's pretty obvious from the news every night. So what do you think can be done from each of your perspective to help us get more childcare in rural America? One or two things. What would help this situation in your communities? And Ellie, let's start with you. What do you think would work in rural Virginia to get more childcare where you are?
So I think speaking more of the 2, 3, 4 range, or the 3 and 4 range, expanding Head Start and public pre-K programs. There is a waiting list. Parents go to the schools on sign-up day, 6 a.m. before the doors even open, because there is such a need for it in our area. And so I think if we're able to add additional classrooms and additional teachers for the Head Start and the pre-K program, the public pre-K programs, that would be incredibly beneficial.
Candace, what about you?
Here in Georgia, the governor has did an amazing job as far as funding to help daycare providers pick back up the pieces from COVID. But I think it would be great if they were to extend the funding to help staff be able to get the educational background that they need to be able to meet the needs of the children. The training is so important, because if you don't know about literacy, fine motor skills, the training is so important. To just make sure that the kids are in a place to where they can fit right in when they go to public school.
One follow on to that, Candace, and I'm curious as to your programs. You know, we talked a little bit about this extended hour, non-traditional hour. What would it take for you to operate your programs for, you know, to meet the needs of some of these extended hours of care? What would you need to be able to do that?
The right staff that has the same heart as I do when it comes down to taking in children. I said I have my program set up for how we want it to be if it was my kid, if I'm dropping my child off at this learning center. So that is very important to me. So important to me. Just being able to have that connection with the parents is very huge. Making the children and the parents feel safe. And it's complicated sometimes just trying to get the staff on the same page as you. That's a challenge, to help them understand that this is our future. We have to be this for our future. So that's very challenging.
Patty, what do you think about this? What could we do to better support childcare in rural parts of the country?
Well, I have a lot of opinions, but I will say that, and I hate to bring it all back to funding, but as I hear everybody talking, there's just not enough investment in early childhood, nationally, in our state certainly, but I think it's broad, and it shouldn't fall all on the parents. So I think funding, and I hear Ellie when she says preschool, whatever form that might be, and hopefully that's mixed delivery from many different programs, and parental choice plays into that. I also think that infant and toddler, that there has to be real emphasis on funding and policies that will support our youngest babies, because providers just can't afford to even the basic to provide that service. It's our ratio for a lot of reasons. And I think policymakers really need to listen to providers and to parents like Ellie and Candace. And what is it that you need? Do you need extended hours? And then how do we fund that? And how do we put policies in place that don't cause barriers, but literally support our families. And in that case, you have to listen. So it really boils down to, and I hate to say this, but it really boils down to some funding and an investment in our youngest children.
The staffing obviously is the most critical part of childcare, but the costs of staying open for extended hours would be a challenge. And I've thought for many years that people think it's cheaper because you have fewer kids. It's actually more expensive in my head to provide care into the evening hours because there are fewer kids, so the costs go up, not down. And I've always been curious as to, is funding a barrier to you doing an extended day in any way?
It is. It's a barrier. Just trying. Yes, it's a barrier. Just being open late, having staff late.
Mm-hmm.
You know, just trying to make sure. Yes, it's a huge barrier. It's a huge barrier.
Candace, do you think if you were able to offer increased pay for a staff member that would stay late or come early, say an additional $2 an hour for those hours on the other side of the workday, would that help at all? Would anybody be interested in those hours?
Absolutely. In our community, though, we have the Boys and Girls Club that offer extended hours. We also have at our public school, they offer extended hours as well. So I help accommodate those students that they can't accommodate. So our public schools has really done an amazing job being able to accommodate the kids for the parents that work later and they don't charge a fee, or their fee is not as expensive, but it's not as much as my fee would be. Mm-hmm. So that has been a huge help in our community here in Adel.
That's interesting. I think that's, that idea of a differential pay for night, evenings, extended hours, et cetera, is something, my work, even in the military, we used to have to pay differential if we went after a certain hours of the day. Might be really good solutions.
Miss Linda, I've tried that years ago, because like Miss Ellie said about the parents that are working from 3 to 11, but I didn't have a lot of kids or a lot of parents that really needed that during the time. So eventually it may be something I will try in the future, but during the time I did try it, it really didn't, help as much as I thought it would in the community.
Interesting. That gets back to parents' choices, Claire, and some of the things that we found. I think at certain hours of the day, parents want their children at home with somebody, a family member, et cetera. But it's all worth, looking at. I see that we're running out of time, and we have had some questions in the chat, which I am going to apologize that we are not going to get to, because I do want to give each of the panelists their one last, opportunity to make a recommendation to Congress on what you think we can do better in terms of at the federal policy level to support parents and children in rural America. If you could say one thing that tell Congress, do this, what would it be? And I'll start with Candace.
I would say funding to be able to help the employees get the educational background that they need. So I would say funding.
Okay, Ellie, how about you?
I think supporting the parents and who are in need of childcare really boils down to supporting the childcare providers and the childcare centers. And whether that comes in the form of funding or education assistance or help with oversight, or whatever their need is, help try to meet them there. And I know that can vary greatly by state because each state has different regulations to meet the childcare licensing standard. So I do think it just help meet those childcare providers and the centers where they need to be met.
Okay, and Patty, you're gonna get to go last on this, your wish list for Congress.
Well, Congress is responsible for the funding, and then we are responsible for what we do with it. So yes, I agree with Ellie and with Candace, we need the funding. I would like to see infrastructure support where communities and public schools are able to come together and support a child from birth to 12th grade. I'd like to see community colleges that are set up to support childcare providers, early childhood education, and I would like to see that free. So I have thoughts about how to use the funding, both in the community and for individuals. But I hate it really does come from Congress. We need more funding, and we need parents and providers at the table to help us figure out what to do with that funding.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to thank our panelists very much and for a great conversation here. Special thanks to Claire, who's hung in there over 5 different surveys and put up with all of our questions and our variations. And especially to everyone for participating in what I think is a great conversation. I think we really do need to take a long, hard look at rural America and how we can do a better job of getting childcare out there to the parents who really do need it desperately. So many thanks to you all, and hopefully we will continue this conversation about childcare in rural America, and we'll actually see something change in the near future on this issue. So thanks again to everyone, and have a great day.